Today, using application integration, we are going to see how we can call an external API, which is a paginated API, how we can use the pagination mechanism of calling this API multiple times and getting all the records from that API, and then go page by page till we reach all the page till the total page size. And then we will fetch this information from this API using recursive calling. And then finally we can use the records to write to Cloud SQL or BigQuery. We are going to set this whole integration in application integration, where we are going to call an external API, get the total number of records, then iterate over the total number of records which we get page by page, fetch all the records, and then finally write it to either BigQuery or Cloud SQL. So I'm going to divide this video into two parts. In the first part, we will do this section where we will call this API, call it recursively, get all the data out of it, and in the next part we will set up a BigQuery dataset and then one by one write all the records in parallel to BigQuery. You can do it into Cloud SQL, it doesn't matter, so I will use BigQuery as an example. Now, to understand what API I'm going to call, I am going to call a dummy.json.com products API. And this API, why it is essential for our example is because it has two parameters, which is limit and skip. And I can use these values to do pagination on the response which the API is sending me back. So just as an example, if I set limit as 10 and skip value as 0 and send this request. So the important part in the first request where you're sending is that this API is responding back with a value of total 194, which means there are 194 records available for us to fetch, but currently we are only fetching 10. So if I go up a little bit, I have 10 records coming back and it's starting from ID 1. The next part, which is also important, is this skip value. So if I give skip value as 10, what will happen in this case is the API is going to skip the first 10 record and send us the set of next 10 record based on our skip value and the limit itself. So if I send this request again, so this time the response came back of products array, which is starting from ID 11, and if I go a little bit down, there is ID 20. Essentially what happened is that the limit is 10 and the skip value is also 10, so the page size is also 10. So with this mechanism, we can call it recursively again and again based on the total number of records, and then keep paginating over set of next 10 record, next 10 record, and then keep fetching everything out of this API itself. Now to start with, let's create an integration. So now we have a blank canvas of application integration available, and we are going to start creating our setup for fetching records. So the first thing first, I need a trigger to trigger the whole process. And then I need to drop a REST API. And this REST API task is going to call our product API. So I'm going to give the endpoint base URL. For this one, currently we do not have any authentication required because this is an open API available without any authentication. But if your API needs any authentication, you can very easily set up a authentication profile, and within that authentication profile you can choose to do different kind of authentication, whether it's auth token, Google OIDC ID token, JSON web token, OAuth 2.0. So depending on what kind of authentication you want to do or mechanism you're following for your API, you can create an authentication profile. The next thing which I want to set up is some parameter. There is a parameter called limit, and I'm going to set it as 1 because in the first call I'm only interested into the value of total number of records, not the actual records itself. And then I'm also going to do a skip of 0 as long as I get the total number of records from my API. It might be different for your own API. You might have a different mechanism of fetching total number of records. If it's a different endpoint, you can call that endpoint, get those total number of records, and start your process from there. Now let's very quickly give it a test and see if we are getting the response back. I will go to the logs. Within the logs, I am going to check the response. So here is the response which is coming back from the API itself, which has products essentially, and then at the bottom it has the total number of records. I'm going to just copy this and I will show you why I'm doing this. So now once the response came back from REST API, I want to fetch the total number of records out. Currently the response is coming as a string value. So to make it easier to manipulate and fetch the data out of this, I'm going to create a temp variable, which is variable type you can leave as none, and it will be a JSON type. And this is where I will copy the sample, and this sample will be taken by application integration and it will create a schema for you. Now you will see that it has this products, JSON, skip, limit and total. So only thing which is remaining is we need to map it out from the response which is coming back to our temp variable, and that is what we are going to do in this data mapper. So now I'm going to drag this total record count temp variable which we created and drag this response body here. So it will map this response into this total count response itself. Now what I also want to do, I want to add another variable just to fetch this total records out, and that total record will be used in further steps so that we can create some kind of mechanism to fetch recursively our API again and again using the skip value and also the limit value. Call it a double because that's the response which is coming from our API itself. Now we have already mapped our total count, so in the same data mapper I'm going to put this total record count temp variable which we created, and this time I'm going to drop this total here. And you have to keep in mind that you have to do this step first and then this step second. If I change the order, my total product count will be empty, so be very careful. Or you can use a different data mapper as a next step, but if you do not want to do that, and I didn't want it to create another data mapper here, so I'm using the same data mapper, but be very careful with the ordering of your setup itself. Now let's run it again and see if our total records are getting set up or values is properly fetched. So now here is our total product count which we have. Now we need to do setup for recursively fetching our records out. To recursively fetch our records out, we need another temp variable which is going to store our skip value, and let's make it a integer and let's give it a default value of 10. So now we have this variable available. So what I'm going to do, I am going to use JavaScript to create a array of values, and this array of values will look something like 0 at first, 10, 20, based on our page size also. So our limit is 10, so every time we iterate, our skip value should start from 0, then go on to 10, then go on to 20, then go on till we have crossed the total number of records. That is, in this case it's 194, so we need to go till 190 and then we have to stop. And because application integration needs an array to iterate over, so we are going to create an array of integer values like 0, 10, 20 and 190, and then stop at the limit of 194, which is our total number of records. For this we can set up a very simple JavaScript. So let me explain what I have done in this JavaScript itself. Is I'm fetching the total product count which we fetched in the previous step, and then also fetching the skip value, integer value which we have set up, total and limit. I'm iterating over or using a for loop that is starting from 0 and going till the total limit of 194, and on every step I'm adding the limit or the skip value which we have, that every time it's 10, then plus 10, plus 10, plus 10, and then every time I'm pushing the I or our counter value to our array, and this is going to give me an array which will look something like this. First time it will be 0, then 10, then 20, and it will keep going on. So as I have set up a parameter here, so I will need a variable to do this. I'm going to call it the same name, and this time it will be an integer array, and let's create it. Now let's very quickly run it and test it whether our variable is getting set up properly. Now if I go to logs, so here is my variable which is coming 0, 10, 20, and it is going till 190. Very easy, not a fancy JavaScript, very easy JavaScript. Now we have an array, so now we need to iterate over it and fetch our actual records so that we can then as a next step write it to BigQuery. So now to do that, what I need to do, I need to create another integration. So you can create a sub integration into different integration, but for this demo purposes, I'm going to create a private integration, and this will be. Now what this integration is going to do, it is going to call the same REST integration which we have. So very quickly, I'm just going to make a copy, move it here, remove this connection and connect this. Let's change the name. The limit and the skip value can be dynamically set, and skip is the value which we have to set as a page size from previous step, and limit is the one which we can set the how many records we want to fetch. Value of skip dynamically iterate over based on the array input which we have created. So which means that I need to send some information to this integration, and that can be done by creating a variable as an input. And since it's an integer, I'm going to call it integer and create this value. I forgot to make it a input to the integration, so let's select that, click on this. Now this is a input to our integration, but since the REST API needs a string value to be put here, so I will create another skip value as temp variable, but this time I will call a make string. Variable type will be none, and let's add a data mapper. Quickly map the input which is coming in as an integer to our string value, and let's use a handy function which application integration provides, to string. That's it. Let's connect this up, and if I go here, I will be able to fetch the variable which is product current skip value. Now we need to send this information to our secondary inner loop. To do that, I'm going to drop a for each parallel. Now why for each parallel is because I want to execute and fetch records in parallel, because they don't have any interdependency. Every time I can go and fetch based on the limits and setup which I have, and I can fetch everything. Now here I need to select an array, and this is the array which we created previously in the JavaScript, skip array value. Now on each integration, I need to call this recursively API call demo video. But before that, because it's a API which we are calling a sub integration, I need to publish it. Go back to enable editing mode. Here I go and select our recursive API call demo video, and the trigger ID will be the private trigger. You can choose sync or async. I'm going to select asynchronous calls, and on each execution, I want to map my value to product current skip value. That is the array value which we are creating will be mapped to the input to this particular inner integration. Now, if I go and test it out, main controller, product current skip value, let's give it 0, and let's go and check the logs. So what happened here is, in the first call, we went and fetched the total number of records. Our total array was set up. This is as we saw previously. Now the important part is that on each parallel task, there are inner recursive loops happening, and then that recursive loop is going to that product API, and every time it's fetching the next set of records. So if we see here the response body of ID 1, it started from 1 and it keeps going on till product 10, and then the next set of records, if I go into the next loop, it will start from product ID 11. This is what is happening, that 11, and so on and so forth. And the last records, which we will see that there will, because there are only 4 records remaining, it starts from 191, it goes to 194, and then the total number of records was only 4 records were fetched. And now we are able to recursively call and fetch all the products from our API recursively and in parallel. So the total execution was done in just 1.28 seconds, which is very fast to fetch 194 records. So now the next step is that we need to write it to BigQuery and that is what we are going to do in the next video.